On the 4th of July this year, the Quincy Institute of Responsible Statecraft quoted John Quincy Adams himself from the year 1821 on July the 4th, writing, "What has America done for the benefit of mankind? Let our answer be this. She goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own." More than 200 years later, no one can really say that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Everyone knows America is not the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. The USA has brought the world 200 years of endless war, bullying, economic coercion, reckless breaches of international law. This crass international bully has now found its perfect symbol, not in the Boston patrician of John Quincy Adams, but in the "you're fired" oligarch, Donald Trump. So enough with the sentimental nonsense that America is an inspiring idea, that it is a force for good in the world. America has become a monster. America has indeed become the monster it hunted abroad for so long. And Emmanuel Todd, the French historian, has seen more clearly than many the nature of that monster. It is American nihilism, the monster of American nihilism. I'm Jeff Rich. Welcome to the Burning Archive, where I help you to make sense of world events in the news with deeper stories from world history and culture. And today we're looking at the idea of American nihilism as put forward by the French historian Emmanuel Todd. The true nature of America, writes Emmanuel Todd, is oligarchy and nihilism. The first one, oligarchy, there's really not a whole lot of doubt anymore. Look at those scenes at Donald Trump's inauguration, let alone events ever since. But the second thought, that America's true nature is nihilism, is a more difficult concept to grasp. It is indeed one of the most challenging thoughts in Emmanuel Todd's book, The Defeat of the West. Many readers and commentators on geopolitics really struggle to understand it because it is quite an innovative and different thought, different to the usual stock of analytical tools on geopolitics. And I think it's also quite a morally challenging and ethically challenging thought to entertain. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Todd has even said recently that events in Palestine and events in Iran only confirm his view that America is driven forward by nihilism, by an irrational desire for violence and destruction. Todd's ideas came up recently on Pascal Lataz's Neutrality Studies channel. Absolutely wonderful channel. If you're not already subscribed to, I really do recommend you do that. In a stimulating discussion with Nikolai Petrov, the American former State Department official and commentator on Russian and Ukrainian affairs. They talked about how American and Western leaders appeared to have left rationality behind and were making inexplicable decisions. Nikolai Petrov actually raised Emmanuel Todd's idea of nihilism. Here's a brief clip from that discussion.
Yeah, but this is one of the reasons why you want to have rational leaders and people in the entire structure of government. There's so many of these things that threaten actual core national interests that I'm led to believe that we are currently seeing a irrational moment in Europe and North America, as we have seen before.
It's not the rationality or irrationality of the statements being made that I look to as concerning. That's not, I think, the most concerning thing. It is the lack of caution, lack of perspective, lack of knowledge and understanding, lack of cultural, historical context, which would tell you that the things that are being said now, although they sound logical, are insane or will lead to a devastating result. One person who has an interesting take on this is Emmanuel Todd. And he looks at it from a somewhat religious perspective, where he draws on the religious context. And he says, we are entering a phase of nihilism. So the loss of faith in anything. And he said, well, it starts with the loss of faith in religion and continues on from there, because religion, any religion, is the foundation of a moral structure. So once you undermine that, you have undermined essentially many of the moral assumptions, and that then undermines many social and political institutions already, which are indirectly based on religion and more directly based on a set of moral assumptions that we should all, it is assumed that we all share, and we stop sharing them. Well, why should we behave in any particular way? That's where irrationality enters in, because we begin behaving in ways that are only rational to ourselves, but irrational to others. And so the larger context that we need to recapture is a sense of common rationality. And that is based on dialogue and a mutual culture. In other words, I have to look at you as worth talking to.
Now, Nikolai Petro's discussion of Emmanuel Todd's idea is partly right, and it does go to some key issues in the problems of American diplomacy, American perception of other countries and cultures around the world. The way he takes the discussion I find admirable. He really does call for dialogue so that people can respect and understand each other, and that is surely the basis for progress. But Nikolai, I don't think really gets to the real heart of Emmanuel Todd's idea of nihilism. So I thought I would do this video just to elaborate on the idea to help the community out there who are interested in Emmanuel Todd's ideas, especially as they applied to analysing what the hell is going on with Donald Trump's or anybody else's America today. I think one of the first things to say is that in part Emmanuel Todd is partly dealing with the same issue that Pascal and Nikolai were wrestling with, the limits of rationality as a way to either explain what international actors are doing, but also the limit of realist ideas of geopolitics that focus exactly on that rationality. If geopolitics is not proceeding on the basis of rational actors calculating how to maximize their power, then a lot of the principles of realist analysis, so-called realist analysis of geopolitics, really break down. Great powers in this theory act as rational, self-interested, coherent actors who maximise their power and national interest. But Emmanuel Todd's book is in part a critique of John Mearsheimer's ideas, for example. He says in his book that history, sociology, anthropology, and the simple factual observation of American society today, Donald Trump's behaviour today, show that there are other drivers and motivations for both geopolitical actors and all of us humans in our behaviour. In particular, there are moments in history when again and again the rational model fails. Sleepwalking to war in World War I, the descent into fascism in many countries in the 1920s and 1930s, and later in some countries. China's Cultural Revolution, the giddy nonsense of America's unipolar moment, arguably events around the world after early 2020. And the wars and catastrophic events that we are witnessing today are only confirming this view. Emmanuel Todd's idea of nihilism springs from this realization. Realism or good intentions do not explain the irrationality of its decision makers, of geopolitical decision makers, or of the United States' current set of decision makers. And it's not just Donald Trump. A much darker side of human behaviour is really needed to explain, or at least a more obscure side of human behaviour is needed to explain how America is rotting domestically, and also to explain its aggressive, unilateral, supremacist, emotionally charged foreign policy. Todd's answer: nihilism. The United States is driven by a need, beyond all other things, an impulse for violence and destruction that it simply does not have the moral apparatus, let's say, to curb. Todd ends his book in commenting on how to make sense of the strategies and choices made by American decision makers. He writes, "If we want to anticipate America's strategic choices, we must urgently abandon the axiom of rationality. The United States is not seeking gains by assessing cost. It's not doing a rational cost-benefit analysis. In the village of Washington, a term I explained in an earlier video, in the land of mass shootings, in the age of zero religion, the primary impulse is the need for violence." That primary impulse of a need for violence then is at the heart of Todd's description of America. America is not falling into a state of nihilism, as Nikolai Petro said. It has fallen into that state of nihilism. Now, nihilism is an unfamiliar term in geopolitical analysis, in historical analysis, you could even say. It's an innovative use of a term, and a deliberate choice by Emmanuel Todd to use this term. It can have many meanings, and Todd uses it in quite a specific way that is different to many and can easily throw you off the track if you want to try to understand it. He has in mind a very specific historical example that I will explain shortly that is essential to understand this most important argument of his book. He's not describing nihilism as a philosophical idea. Within formal philosophy, nihilism is the position that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. But Todd is not writing as a philosopher, nor arguing about systemic philosophical ideas. He is an Annals School of History historian of mentalities, the broad assumptions people have in society that shape their conduct. He writes as a historical sociologist with a literary imagination. He has a great style. And there's an important clue there. His idea of nihilism is closer to that presented by Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, in his book The Devils, or sometimes translated as The Possessed. In this novel, there are a group of idealistic radicals who are drawn into terroristic murder by a cell of radical nihilists. Dostoevsky based his novel on real historical characters in Russia in the late 19th century who pursued revolutionary violence. They were estranged from collective belief after the death of God, in Nietzschean terms, and are unchecked in their pursuit of revolt, power, and violence. In his own words, Dostoevsky sought to, quote, depict those diverse and multifarious motives by which even the purest of hearts in the most innocent of people can be drawn into committing such monstrous offence. Similarly, in Todd's book, The Defeat of the West, he explores how that most pure of heart country, the USA that John Quincy Adams described as the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, the indispensable leader of the free world. Todd described how the USA has been drawn into committing such monstrous, violent offences as Gaza, Iran, Ukraine, Iran, Vietnam, Hiroshima, and 200 years of endless war. Todd presents on a geopolitical stage Dostoevsky's story. An idealistic America, once founded in Protestantism, has been stripped of real shared beliefs or values in what Todd calls a state of zero religion. This demoralised America was led by the Washington Gang, Todd's term for the foreign policy elite, let's say, in pursuit of a liberal world revolution that drew them into violence, destruction, and catastrophic hubris, just like Dostoevsky's group of nihilistic radicals. They fell into the trap of Ukrainian nihilism, and now the absolute nihilism of the Gaza genocide. Now, there is a common objection I want to deal with here in making this argument. Todd is not being anti-American. He's not some snooty French guy who just doesn't like the USA. He struggled with a moral problem. He confronted his own disappointment that America was not living up to John Quincy Adams' ideals. He was brought up in a pro-American or sympathetic to American, Anglo-American culture, French family, to believe that The USA really was the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. He had to come to terms with the disappointment of how America had failed to live up to its promise to the world. It had fallen from being an opponent between 1941 and 1945 of the nihilism of Nazi Germany, and instead has now become the sponsor and principal perpetrator of nihilistic violence in the world today. The concept of nihilism in power has been applied before to Nazi Germany. In Defeat of the West, Todd makes this comparison between America today and Nazi Germany in the 1930s explicit. Many of the casual commentators on Todd's work, like Nikolai Petro or Pepe Escobar or Alistair Cook, focus on the religious civilizational aspect of Todd's argument rather than this imported historical comparison. But his use of this historical idea of nihilism is essential to his argument. He makes this comparison reluctantly and with diffidence, because it is confronting to say that the indispensable nation, the leader of the free world, has become the monster it once fought in World War II, and that it has heroically defeated alone in Hollywood movies for 80 years since. Here is the key passage from Todd's book that helps you understand this deeper meaning of American nihilism. Quote, "It seemed necessary to me to have a central concept that symbolized America's conversion from good to evil. Our intellectual problem deep down is that we love America. The United States was one of the powers that brought down Nazism. They showed us the way to achieve prosperity. To fully accept the idea that today they follow a path that leads to poverty and social atomization, the concept of nihilism is essential." So Todd does draw direct historical comparisons between Germany in the 1930s and 40s and America today, and that is deeply challenging for us all. We want to believe that push comes to shove, America is a force for good in the world. We hope and base alliances on the hope that on balance the USA has done and will do more good in the world than harm for the world. So to confront the idea that America's fundamental nature is violence, deception, nihilism, and evil is a profoundly challenging thought. Not only has the US, in John Quincy Adams' words gone abroad in search of monsters to destroy, it has become the monster prowling the world in a spree of bombing countries back to the Stone Age. Bullying, coercion, destruction, tariffs, and war. Now, Todd does draw some distinctions between Nazism and America today, specifically on the idea of his idea of zero-state religion. He notes that Nazism appeared in a period when religion in Germany was in what he calls a zombie state, where the practice of the faith, e.g. going to church, was declining, but the moral codes persisted in society. From the 1930s through to the 1960s, America was similarly in a zombie phase of religion, in Todd's argument, but had a more positive political culture. America often refers to this as the period of the greatest generation. American culture was indeed boosted by generations of immigrants and refugees from Europe and Nazism. For example, Hannah Arendt. From the presidencies of Roosevelt to Eisenhower, America, Todd writes, America began to build a social state. Its universities produced mass quality education. It spread an optimistic culture that appealed to the world. This America, Todd argues, benefited from the positive social values of Protestantism, high literacy, high educational level, democratic ethos, egalitarianism among whites, that is. Todd is quite clear that this America was an exclusive society. In the South, in effect, an apartheid society, really, in the 1950s and 1960s. But it was trying to get rid of its negative values of racism, puritanism, sexism, machismo, and all the rest. But that America is gone. Todd argues it is now in a zero state of religion where there is no guiding ethos and where nihilism and narcissism reign supreme. Rather than the greatest generation, you have the Washington gang of Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Donald Trump, and the list, Pete Hegseth, and the list goes on. The social crisis in America reinforces its demoralized state as a nihilistic empire. For Todd, this explains both the Trump administration and Biden's foreign policy. The internal rot as well as the external megalomania, the violence that the American system exercises on its own citizens and on those of other countries. As I mentioned before, there was a specific previous historical comparison between Nazi Germany and nihilism, and that was in a book by Hermann Röchning, a conservative German politician who briefly joined the National Socialist Party, but then renounced Nazi Party membership in 1934 and in 1936 emigrated from Germany, ultimately ending up in the United States around the same time as Thomas Mann, effectively the great writer, did the same thing. He wrote a book called The Revolution of Nihilism, a warning to the West, and he wrote that in 1939. The book was very successful in the United States, although it was directed primarily at conservatives in Nazi Germany. Röchning hoped to warn them of the alleged anti-Christian nature of the Nazi revolution and to restore the monarchy. Todd does not repeat those arguments, but he does refer to Röchning in comparing some aspects of the social and cultural crisis of Germany in the 1930s with the social crisis driving American nihilism today. Todd argues what they have in common is, quote, they have a vacuum as their driving force. In both cases, political life functions without values. It is only a movement which tends towards violence. Röchning did not define Nazism otherwise. First, as a member of the National Socialist Party of Germany, he left it. This normal conservative, so to speak, could not tolerate gratuitous violence. He would not have been behind that. In today's America, this is Todd writing, I observe in terms of thought and ideas a dangerous state of emptiness with residual obsessions with money and power. These cannot be goals in themselves or values. This void induces a propensity for self-destruction, militarism, endemic negativity, in short, nihilism. Think of Trump talking about obliteration or threatening to bomb Moscow or Beijing. Think of America's crisis of opioid use and its complete inability to accept its own responsibility for that problem. Think of J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth and all the others looking on from the Situation Room or their Signal app on their phones during the bombing of poor people in Yemen, destroying whole apartment buildings and their residents, women, children, old people, to assassinate one guy, and then sending each other emojis and saying, "Great job, team." That is American nihilism. Let me share one quote from Rorschnig's forgotten book from the Burning Archive of Forgotten Books that sheds an uncanny light on the affinity between the style and behaviour of the 1930s Germany and America today, not in that they are authoritarian, a much overused word in my opinion, but in this astonishing need for violence. Rorschnig wrote, "The nihilist foreign policy of the National Socialism of today, the Nazi Party of Germany in the 1930s, the nihilist foreign policy of the National Socialism of today," Rorschnig wrote in 1939, "uses ideas as a mask and has no philosophical basis." Wow, doesn't that describe the foreign policy of Donald Trump? Indeed, doesn't it describe the presidency of Joe Biden or the false promised land of Barack Obama or the grotesque masks worn by Peter Thiel and the weirdo Silicon Valley pseudo-philosophers like Curtis Yarvin, who conceal behind big philosophical ideas their fundamental destructiveness, their resentment, their greed, their vicious desire to dominate, their lack of a good education, even to the point of seeking to transcend humanity. It's as if they'd never read Dr. Faustus. Rorschnig wrote of the Nazis, "Their ultimate aim is the maximum of power and dominion. The means is subversion, the destruction of the existing order, so as to have a free hand for the building of a new and greater dominion. Moreover, the central ideal of this urge is the redistribution of the world." Another affinity with American foreign policy, and that, after all, is the philosophy of Peter Thiel. This is the embodied resentment of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. This is the nihilism of the permanent American Revolution, drowning, not waving, in the deep social crisis that Emmanuel Todd describes in The Defeat of the West. Now, there is one more dimension of nihilism in Todd's analysis that is central to American political culture, not just Donald Trump's presidency, and that is the refusal of reality. He writes in The Defeat of the West, "A final essential element made me adopt this concept, the refusal of reality." Nihilism, in fact, does not only reflect the need to destroy oneself or others. More profoundly, when it transforms into a kind of religion, it tends to deny reality. Karl Rove, George Bush the younger president's media advisor, Karl Rove, famously said America could create its own reality. It is the greatest of American illusions when reality appears despite the illusion. America lashes out in violence. It obliterates weapons of mass destruction that in reality were never there. Todd goes on to show in his book practical examples of this nihilism and this denial of reality. He shows how in healthcare the United States spends more to die more. He shows how the USA fails to respond constructively to the devastating opioids crisis, how in fact the US Congress actively enabled the death of thousands of Americans by its approach to opioid medication. These are social policy examples of applied nihilism. But most of all, American nihilism is shown in America's addiction to war, to fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, to bombing countries back to the Stone Age, to slapping punitive tariffs on countries merely for talking back to the boss. America has become a monstrous nihilistic empire rampaging abroad. We, the 96% of the world that is not the USA, all live in fear of what the nihilistic leaders of this monster might do next. Todd has spoken of his fear that America may again do the unimaginable. After all, Defense Secretary, Deputy Defense Secretary Elbridge Colby, China hawk, actively advocates the use of tactical nuclear weapons to fight a war against China for no other reason than to keep the title of American primacy. Todd concludes his book, America's sociological zero state, however, prevents us from making reasonable predictions about the ultimate decisions its leaders will make. Let us keep in mind that nihilism makes everything, absolutely everything, possible. He went on to write a postscript to the book on the situation in Gaza. Let me read from that final sentence that I quoted from earlier to return to Pascal Lotaz's and Nikolai Petro's question about the irrationality of America's decision makers. If we want to anticipate America's strategic choices, we must urgently abandon the axiom of rationality. The United States is not seeking gains by assessing costs. In the village of Washington, in the land of mass shootings, in the age of zero religion, the primary impulse is a need for violence. That is so important, and that is the fundamental idea of nihilism described in Emmanuel Todd's book, The Defeat of the West, and in his many interviews now on YouTube. There are, of course, many questions you could ask of Emmanuel Todd's history and his analysis, but I think there is no doubt that he is onto something about American nihilism and the culture, not just among elites, but broadly in American society, that is driving on this relentless violence. America is not the light on the hill. It is not, in John Quincy Adams' words, the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, the champion and vindicator only of her own. It does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. It is the monster abroad, destroying the world. That is the true meaning of American nihilism. Thanks for watching. You can support my work at jeffrich.substack.com by becoming a paid subscriber there and get deeper dives into history, world culture and world affairs. I put a lot of effort into sharing my knowledge and experience to help you live in tune with a changing world. I hope it does help you. And if you're interested in Emmanuel Todd's ideas, do check out my playlist on Emmanuel Todd right here.